And in just a moment, live coverage of a discussion on cultural diversity on college campuses. You'll hear from two authors of books on the topic, Peter Thiel and John Wilson. The event is being hosted by the Heritage Foundation. Matthew Spalding, the organization's educational programs director, moderates.
Should I do anything with this mic?
No.
Just leave it here?
Yeah. Good evening. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and to the Third Generation. I'm Matthew Spalding, Director of Lectures and Educational Programs here. For those of you who are not familiar with our program, the Third Generation is a monthly series of panels, debates, and lectures especially arranged for young conservative activists around town. If you're not on our mailing list, please sign up on one outside. And I have one announcement, and that is a week from Saturday is our annual Third Generation Conference. There are nice flyers out in the lobby as well. I encourage you to pick one up. That's April 13th at the Crystal City Marriott in Arlington. Our topic is Issues 96, Implications for the Next Generation. As you'll see, we have a nice arrangement of speakers, and I encourage you to take a look at that. If you need any other information, you're always welcome to call the Heritage Foundation or look us up on our website on the internet, and I encourage you to do so. For some time now, the so-called multicultural debate has dominated the debate over the American Academy. Many professors and students have argued that identity or group politics have overtaken many prestigious universities at the cost of truth and Western civilization. Others, on the other hand, say political correctness is but a fictitious label applied by those who essentially are threatened by what is no more than a broadening curriculum. Peter Thiel is a product of Stanford's undergraduate and law schools and is now a research fellow at the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. He is the author of The Diversity Myth, Multiculturalism, and the Politics of Intolerance at Stanford. He argues in his book that political correctness at Stanford has been an expensive, catastrophic, and failing experiment, and that this multicultural program is but an example of the widespread problems that threaten our educational system today. John Wilson, on my left, is a graduate of the University of Illinois and is now a graduate student at the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. And he is the author of The Myth of Political Correctness, the conservative attack on higher education. Now, in his book, he argues that political correctness is not a real phenomenon at all, but merely a rhetorical argument used by conservatives to reframe academic debates and questions which they are essentially losing, and that the real threat comes not from the left, but indeed from the right. So, our question for this evening is, political correctness and multiculturalism on campus, does it exist? And most importantly, is it good for higher education? Now, our speakers will each make an opening statement of 5 minutes, followed by a rebuttal of 8 minutes, and a closing statement, succinct closing statement of 2 minutes. This format allows us the most time for questions and discussion afterwards from the audience. So, with that, we will begin with Mr. Wilson. It's all yours.
Thank you. Political correctness, I think, deserves some kind of award as the best soundbite of the 1990s. when you consider that in 1990, no one, practically no one, including me, had ever heard of it. But today, it now has a permanent place in our culture, in our dictionaries, and in our common discourse. And that came to me most powerfully earlier this year during an episode of The Simpsons. And the episode of The Simpsons told the story of the town's celebration of the bicentennial of its namesake and Revolutionary War hero, Jebediah Springfield. And Lisa Simpson's class is assigned to write a paper about Jebediah. And as usually happens, Lisa turns out to be too smart for her own good. She discovers that Jebediah Springfield was not really a hero, but was in fact an evil pirate who once tried to rob George Washington. So she turns in this paper to her class, revealing the truth. And when she gets it back, it has a big red F on it. And her teacher says, quote, "This is nothing more than dead white male bashing from a PC thug." And Lisa, distraught, goes home and tells her father, "She called me a PC thug." And Homer replies, "Well, I've been called a greasy thug too, and it never stops hurting." Now, Homer Simpson may be the only person in America, animated or otherwise, who hasn't heard about political correctness. But like the teacher who calls Lisa Simpson a PC thug for telling the truth, I think political correctness gets used to demonize opponents and to dismiss criticism of our traditions and of conservatives. So in that sense, I'm not here to deny or to defend political correctness. I'm here to deny the existence of it, in the sense that there is this accusation from conservatives that a leftist conspiracy has taken over college campuses, that it is imposing a totalitarian regime, that it is silencing conservative views, that it is discarding the classics in favor of left-wing multiculturalism, and it is ruining academic standards. Now, of course, there are cases where conservatives are censored. There are cases where leftists display intolerance of other views. And we need to oppose that kind of intolerance and censorship. But there's a curious inconsistency on the attacks on political correctness. The right-wing critics of PC, from Dinesh D'Souza to Lynn Cheney, will recount in endless detail all of the anecdotes about the left, from the silly to the inaccurate to the genuinely dangerous to academic freedom. But they won't say a word about what is called conservative correctness, the numerous cases where the right infringes upon the academic freedom of leftists, feminists, and gay and lesbian students and faculty, to name just a few. To give you just a few examples of what you won't hear about from Dinesh D'Souza or the people on the right, the case of an English professor at Nyack College who's fired for wearing a support gay rights button on her briefcase, and the president of the college who, when he defended her, was also dismissed. A woman at Brigham Young University, an English professor who was dismissed for making a pro-choice speech, and where now, earlier this year, the university decided that all professors must be approved by their local church leaders as good Mormons in order to remain employed. Another case, Lee Griffith at Elmira College, a campus minister who was fired for writing a letter about gay bashing on campus, and because he urged that non-discrimination policies based on sexual orientation be implemented. Kenneth Gowdy, a professor at Bethel College, who was fired for suggesting that homosexuality might be permissible in lifelong relationships. George Roach, the president of Hillsdale College, who, among his various activities, forced the editor of the student newspaper to resign and banned an alternative student newspaper from campus because it was critical of the administration, and then proceeded to expel the student who published that paper. And in addition, he was censured by the American Association of University Professors a few years ago for firing a professor who had dared to criticize the college. And John Silber, president of Boston University, who, among his other things, was found guilty of sex discrimination for denying tenure to a female professor who was unanimously approved by her department and a faculty committee. And Silber, in the proceedings, referred to the department as a damn matriarchy. He also, incidentally, has recently denied tenure to a sociologist who had near unanimous approval from his department because Silber did not approve of the sociologist's liberal views, even though the book that the sociologist had written recently won an award from the American Sociological Association. So those are just a few examples among many that I can cite of conservative correctness that you never hear about. As for multiculturalism, I think I have to say that reports of the death of Shakespeare have been greatly exaggerated. Let me give you just one anecdote here from Christopher Clausen of the Penn State English Department, who was the chair there. He once said, quote, "I would bet that the color purple is taught in more English courses today than all of Shakespeare's plays combined." Now, if this were true, it would be a sign of a great revolution in higher education, and one that frankly would disturb me, if it were true. However, I happened, when I was a student at the University of Illinois, to investigate this interesting little claim. I looked through the assignments for the English department at the University of Illinois, and I found no less than 5 introductory Shakespeare classes, 5 advanced Shakespeare classes, an honors seminar on Shakespeare, a graduate seminar on Shakespeare, and 8 non-Shakespeare classes that included Shakespeare as an author, far more than any other author. There was one class that was reading The Color Purple. And if you take the ratio of the number of students reading a Shakespearean play versus the number of students reading The Color Purple, it was 100 to 1. Yet, this statement by Clausen was repeatedly cited by William Bennett, by Dinesh D'Souza, as evidence of this grand revolution in higher education. What I think we have to do is realize that what's been said about political correctness, what's been said about multiculturalism, is often not the case, that the facts lie otherwise. There hasn't been a takeover by the left of higher education. There is instead, I think, a great danger in the right-wing attack on political correctness that is, in fact, an attack on academic freedom and on higher education. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Mr. Teal?
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. Also, I'd like to thank the Heritage Foundation for organizing this very important, very timely debate on this topic. And I guess I will start off, obviously I disagree with John on many different points, but I suppose I would start by agreeing that a great part of this debate turns on how a lot of the issues are framed. It is, in many ways, a debate over a variety of words like political correctness, like multiculturalism, like diversity, and what these things actually mean. And so I want to, instead of talking about political correctness in my opening, I'd like to just say a few things about multiculturalism and diversity. And I think the most critical point I want to make to you today is that these are euphemisms. Let's start with multiculturalism. Multiculturalism has next to nothing to do with the study of other cultures. I will repeat it. If there's a single thing I'd like you to take with you today, it is that multiculturalism has next to nothing to do with the study of other cultures. That may be a worthwhile thing to do in an increasingly global world, but that's not what it is about. You do not see students protesting on college campuses demanding missionary postings in third world countries to learn more about other societies. You do not have protests demanding more rigorous foreign language requirements where people will protest to learn Chinese or Swahili or Russian or anything of that sort. Again, it has nothing to do with other cultures. The same, I think, is true of diversity. This is another one of these incredibly misleading euphemistic terms. It does not, to put it charitably, have much to do with a diversity of ideas. You do not have real diversity on a college campus when you have a campus full of people who look different but think alike. And again, I think this is very, very important as a starting point in framing the issue. Well, the question then becomes, well, what are these things really about? What is multiculturalism really about? And I will suggest to you that the single most important theme that runs through much that goes under the rubric of multicultural is that it is anti-Western. It is not non-Western. It is still focused very much on our own society, but it is primarily a vehicle for denouncing it. At Stanford University, which is the one I'm the most familiar with, but I think is certainly no exception to the rule, the debate over multiculturalism in the late 80s started with a protest. The protest was against Western culture. The notorious chant was, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's gotta go." It was not a demand for inclusion, it was a demand for exclusion. Now, why does Western culture have to go? What is the problem with multiculturalism? And what problem does it have? The basic problem, the basic claim is the West is uniquely bad because it is racist, it is sexist, it is oppressive in a variety of other ways. And not only does it have all these problems, but it has them in a way that is far worse than other societies. That's where I think things get very, very problematic. The multicultural educator at Stanford University liked to go around saying, I started looking for racism everywhere, and I started finding racism everywhere. And indeed he did. If you start looking for anything everywhere, you will start finding it everywhere. If you are a feminist, and if you believe that everything that is longer than it is wide is a symbol of male oppression, then you will start finding sexism everywhere. If you want to find baseball everywhere, you can find baseball everywhere. And similarly, he could find racism everywhere. Let me just give you a couple of examples of how this process played out. There was an ongoing debate over boycotting table grapes. The fact that table grapes were served in student residences was viewed as evidence of racism. Why? Well, because most of the grape pickers in California happened to be Latino farm workers, and they were exposed to dangerous pesticides, supposedly. Now, the fact that a grape boycott would get rid of their jobs was sort of irrelevant because, again, many of these things involve more moral posturing than real substantive concerns over these issues. There was similarly a debate over what students are politically correct, politically incorrect. And again, if we want to talk about examples of political correctness, the Black Student Union at Stanford for a number of years maintained something called a blacklist of students that were insufficiently black, of black students who were insufficiently black, which meant that they did not have the ideological views that multiculturalism claims all blacks must hold. Multiculturalism does not have to do with biology, it has to do with ideology. And the ideology across the board is this far left ideology. Now, I'll tell you what the problem is with looking for racism everywhere. Because when you start looking for racism everywhere and you start finding racism everywhere, it's only a very small step to finding racists everywhere. Now, there's nothing wrong with that if those racists are really out there, but I'm going to suggest to you that they really aren't. The problems of racism, sexism, other forms of oppression have been vastly exaggerated, and as a result, people get unjustly accused. A culture of complaint leads to a culture of blame, and that is ultimately the real problem with it. Let me just make one last comment, then we'll go on from here. The other point that, and along these lines, let me suggest to you that multiculturalism and political correctness must be thought of as different sides of the same coin. The multicultural side is the side where we look for the victims. The politically correct side is the side where we go after the victimizers. The two are inextricably interconnected. You are not going, and that is why you will find the people who are the most multicultural are also the most politically correct. I'll leave it at that for now.
Great. John, is Peter correct about that?
No, of course he's wrong about everything. Now, I would agree with him on some points. Obviously, I'm very disturbed by the idea of a blacklist at Stanford, the idea of evaluating people according to their blackness and such nonsense. On the other hand, it's certainly not the case that there's no racism at Stanford. You can take, he mentions the example of table grapes. I don't want to get into the whole issue of table grapes and whether someone should be boycotting them or not. But it was very interesting. There was a case at Stanford where there was a movie about grapes and the boycott that was being shown before a feature film at the Stanford Theater. And some people in the audience were apparently upset that they were being deprived of their feature film and forced to sit through this propaganda. And they started yelling, "Go home, Beaners," which some people might take, and I would take, as a racist thing to say. Another example of bigotry which is cited in Peter's book is the case, and is actually cited as an example of multiculturalism and the evils that go too far, is the case of Keith Rabois, who is a student at the Stanford Law School, who, going past the cottage of a resident assistant on campus, yelled, what was the exact phrase, Peter, that he yelled?
I'm not going to repeat it.
Faggot, hope you die of AIDS. And it's interesting in that case that you didn't see the PC thought police coming after him. You didn't see him being brought up on charges. What you saw instead was members of the Stanford community expressing their distaste, expressing their displeasure with that, saying that was wrong. He was never brought up on any charges. He was never forced to leave despite all the claims of this Stanford speech code, which incidentally was never enforced against anyone, despite all the claims that there's censorship of conservative views going on. Even that kind of despicable speech wasn't prosecuted at Stanford. Peter is right about some things about multiculturalism. It isn't primarily about other cultures, I don't think. It's primarily about our culture. Multiculturalism is about the idea that there's more to Western culture, there's more to U.S. history than what has been traditionally taught. That there is an aspect of history that has been ignored, dealing with women, dealing with minorities, dealing with all sorts of issues that don't make it into the standard texts of history books. And I think there are wonderful changes going on, that there are progress being made in terms of opening up history, of debating issues like race, gender, class, that didn't get talked about in the past. And I think we need to go on debating them and not shut off the debate. And I think that's exactly what happened at Stanford. It simply wasn't the case that Stanford, in developing its Western culture program, got rid of the classics. What it did was it added things that people might not otherwise read, texts and works that weren't part of the traditional Western heritage, but that were interesting and important to read. In the case of the hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go, there's some question as to whether it referred to Western culture in small caps or Western culture, the name of the class at Stanford that these students wanted to have replaced. So, what I think we need to do is take a realistic view of what's going on in college campuses. I think the intolerance is not towards the people who believe in traditional views, it's towards the people who want to open up the curriculum. And it's simply not the case that multiculturalism is getting rid of Western culture. In fact, there's a study in the past few decades, colleges requiring courses in the history of Western civilization, even while you had this multicultural movement over the past few decades. The number of colleges requiring Western civilization actually increased from 43% in 1970 to 48% in 1985 to 53% in 1990. So it's not the case that Western culture is getting dismissed. Instead, Western culture is being argued about, and that's what's facing so much resistance, that questioning some of the traditions of our culture, questioning some of our past is being taken as, denouncing it as being taken as anti-Western, or in some cases anti-American. The best example of that I can cite to you are the National History Standards, which recently made the news today. What you had with the National History Standards was, in my opinion, a wonderful, well-thought-out attempt to improve the teaching of history in America, improve the textbook writing in America, that was denounced for political reasons. It was attacked, for example, by Senator Slade Gorton as perverted, anti-American, anti-Western, a monument to political correctness that, quote, must be recalled like a shipload of badly contaminated food. It was condemned by Newt Gingrich on C-SPAN, where he decried the destructive impact of the left-wing attempt to rewrite American history, and declared that the National Endowment for the Humanities has gone off the deep end on proposing changes that are destructive of American civilization. So there wasn't an effort here to argue, an effort to discuss or bring up different points of view in an attempt to improve the standards. It was destructive, purely destructive. And in fact, many, like Lynn Cheney, actually proposed getting rid of the NEH because it had dared to promote this national history standards that, in fact, were not left-wing biased, that were quite a wonderful attempt. And many of the accusations that you heard about were, in many cases, completely false. Accusations, for example, about putting John Rockefeller on trial for his monopolyism. That's a suggested example in the standards that no longer is in there. Well, of course, putting people on trial is part of our Western standard of debating ideas. That's one way we do it, is to put things on trial. And of course, you didn't hear about Andrew Carnegie glorifying in the standards the superior wisdom, experience, and ability to administer of the men of wealth. You didn't hear about how the standards asked, quote, what are the benefits of multinational corporations? What you did hear about were a number of examples that were simply false. One of my favorites from Lynn Cheney was when what she called, quote, the single most irresponsible part of the national standards, where she said, quote, no mention is made of why American leaders decided to drop atomic bombs, about the casualties they believed would have been suffered in an invasion of Japan, for example. Yet, if you look at the standards, this is on page 202 of the standards, students are asked to, quote, draw evidence reflecting different perspectives to analyze within its historical context to use the atomic bomb on Japan, including estimated military and civilian casualties in a prolonged war, and long-term consequences as understood in 1945. Now, if this claim about the most irresponsible part of the standards is a lie, then I think we have to realize that the whole attack on the national history standards has been a lie. It's been a very effective one, such that the standards have now been decimated. The people who wrote them have agreed to remove all of these controversial examples, to remove all the controversy from it. I think what we need to do is put controversy back into education. We need to debate these issues and discuss them and not be afraid of asking these questions, not be afraid of discussing these issues. Because that, I think, would fear of multiculturalism would be a far more destructive thing to us than multiculturalism itself.
Thank you, John. Peter, counterpoint?
Sure. Well, let me make a couple of points here. You know, I guess the first thing I mean, I obviously agree with it on this level of abstraction. You know, we do want to have controversy. We do want to have a thoughtful discussion about many different issues. And I suppose, you know, John, you're right. You know, probably in the late 19th century, accounts of Western history were somewhat unduly rosy. People were somewhat ridiculously self-congratulatory, and I think that was a mistake. I do think things have gone way too far in the other direction today, where we have this sort of scorched earth strategy being waged against our own society, and I think we have to find some sort of balance between the two. Now, it's always difficult to know exactly where you draw the balance, but I'd suggest to you one indicator. And I think one very important salient feature is, of course, that this whole multicultural debate over looking at racism, sexism, other forms of oppression is something that could only take place within the context of Western civilization, within the context of the civilization where individual rights, individual human rights became possible. And multiculturalists go too far when they forget that the very rhetoric that animates their debate is the rhetoric of the West. And they always forget this. They always forget it. So I do think they go too far, at least in that one extremely salient regard. Now, again, there's a question of emphasis. How far does it really go in practice? I will suggest to you that the reason the chant, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's gotta go, was so powerful was because it actually referred to two different things. It referred to a class, and it referred to the culture that was being studied in the class. It incredibly succinctly encapsulated what people in higher education had been saying for quite a long time, and the tenor with which they had been saying it. You said a few other things about speech codes. This is sort of the bigger problem, is that on a lot of these college campuses we have speech codes where people feel they cannot debate topics and so on. And it is true that these speech codes are often not very rigorously enforced. They're not very precise. They are, in fact, it's often very unclear what you can say and what you cannot say. But I will suggest to you they have a tremendous stifling effect nonetheless, because the way these speech codes work in practice is that you as a student will err on the side of silence. They are incredibly inhibiting of controversial discourse. The point of the Keith Rabois episode, just to sort of provide the details that John omitted, was that it was sort of Keith was, perhaps this was the wrong thing to do, but he attempted to create a test case of the speech code. And his speech did not, strictly speaking, fall out. It was, strictly speaking, still protected under the speech code at Stanford, but at the same time, the point is there are very few people who say things like Keith, who feel free to say those things, or who would say those things if they were not trying to create a test case. There is no problem of racist speech on campus. There is no problem with racism. There is no problem with sexism. Or to the extent there is a problem, it is not very big. One of the reasons multiculturalism was able to get off the ground in the first place is that most college-age students, and especially those who are attending our top universities, are not bigots. There are very few who are. And so I think one of the really big problems we have to come to grips with is this sense in which the reason we have racial tensions in our society, the reason we have other kinds of tensions, is not because there is a problem with racism and other forms of oppression, but because people are looking for these things too much. If you are dealing with a multicultural educator who is looking for racism everywhere and who's finding racism everywhere, then I think one of the things you might do is you might just stay clear of that person. Because whatever you're going to say, if you ask them about racism, well, that's evidence of racism. If you don't ask them about racism, that's evidence that you're not interested in that you're racist. It's a no-win, you-lose situation. You will stay totally clear of that whole debate. And so I will suggest to you one of the reasons we do have some tensions between different groups of people in our society is, in fact, precisely because the focus on these issues has become so misplaced. In many ways, the cure is worse than the disease at this point. John also said some very interesting things about sort of his examples of conservative correctness, and I'm not going to sit here and defend everything that everyone who's conservative or claims to be conservative has said or done in the last 20 or 30 years. But I will suggest that the scope of the problem is primarily a problem of the left. And this is simply numerically the case. If you look at the breakdown of people who are teaching in higher education, most of them are liberal, most of them are on the far left end of the political spectrum. Again, Stanford's very representative in this regard. In the humanities departments, by political party affiliation, you had about 80% plus Democrats, 10% independents, and fewer than 10% Republicans. And that understates the ideological bias because the Republicans tend to be middle-of-the-road Republicans. The Democrats tend to be very far to the left of the Democratic Party. There is an interesting theoretical question. If conservatives controlled these institutions of education, would they behave any better than the liberals are now behaving? I do not know the answer to that, but that's not what we're debating today. We're debating what's actually happening, and what's actually the case is, of course, that the problem is primarily one on the left, primarily because most of the people are, in fact, liberals, and you have to go to some very small, exceptional colleges to find a different pattern. I personally would say that a religious school is in a somewhat different category, that a religious school can impose standards. It can say, we are not going to have someone who is pro-choice teaching in a Catholic university. If that would seem to me to be a matter that is totally up to the private university. However, and again, this debate is primarily about what's happening at the leading large universities, the major public universities, and some of the leading private universities. And they do not advertise themselves as liberal institutions. They advertise themselves as open-minded, diverse institutions. And so I would suggest to you, I would be quite happy if we just had some truth in advertising. If we are going to be enforcing a liberal orthodoxy, then let us say so. And if you are willing to say so, and you have a private university that receives no government funding or virtually no government funding, you have a right to do that. But you should not go around suggesting you're inclusive and open-minded when that is one of the furthest things from the truth. Finally, let me make one other comment on sort of this question about all these politically correct anecdotes, whether these anecdotes are true or false, whether Lynn Cheney got her details wrong on page 200-something, and so on. I am sure that some of the anecdotes may have been exaggerated in the retelling. That's quite conceivable. But I will suggest to you, John, that this latest politically correct line, there's no such thing as political correctness, is ultimately just not going to wash. And the reason it's not going to wash is not because there are lots and lots of different anecdotes and I'm going to overwhelm you with dozens of them, although I could spend the next 3 hours telling you one anecdote after another, like the blacklist, like the grape boycott, et cetera, down the line. But the reason it's not going to wash is that the reason people believe these anecdotes is not because there is a conservative, heterosexual, white male conspiracy to spread these anecdotes. It is because most people in their day-to-day lives have experienced something like it. Maybe not quite as bad as what happened to, say, a cafeteria worker at Stanford who still served grapes and was pelted with them one day. They were a little bit behind the times. Or perhaps not quite as bad as the students who made the blacklist and were shunned for their 4 years as an undergraduate education. But people have experienced things that are close enough to this. And that is why I think we see a very broad coalition against political correctness. It's not just conservatives. It is also a lot of liberals, say liberals who may be pro-life on an issue, people who do not necessarily fit a well-defined ideological box. They get hammered on those issues, they get hammered on other issues, and that's why a lot of people are saying enough is enough. In putting together the diversity myth, one of the interesting things my co-author and I found was that we got some of the most enthusiastic support from people who would be considered on the liberal or moderate end of the political spectrum. They are often the ones who are in academia. They're the traditional academics who tend to be politically quite liberal, but who don't necessarily want to follow this hard left party line. And they have simply had it. And that's why there is this debate about political correctness, and that's why we're going to have to do something about the problem. Thank you.
Good. Well, I'm TC, time correct. So we have 2 minutes each for a closing statement and take it away.
I think what Peter tells you about people feeling suppressed, feeling censored, you have to be very careful about that, because that's a common feeling of any student who goes into any classroom. I felt it in economics classrooms where you're not allowed to challenge a certain orthodoxy of the free market assumptions. I've found it in lots of other classes. I've talked to students who feel like they can't express feminist views. I've talked to people in my own department who feel they can't do a dissertation on feminist ideas. If you look at these anecdotes, if you look at what people experience, I think you'll find that there are many more sexist or racist or anti-gay remarks on college campuses than there are remarks attacking white male conservative heterosexuals. And this whole idea that white male conservative heterosexuals are the victims of oppression on college campuses seems to me rather laughable in the face of real evidence, as opposed to what all of the right-wing foundations and right-wing newspapers push at everybody. I don't think there is a wave of censorship on college campuses. I don't think there is this tremendous stifling effect that Peter talks about. On the contrary, the University of Chicago, where I'm a student, has a speech code. It prohibits something called personal abuse. I don't know what personal abuse is. It's a very vague and ill-defined term. I don't feel silenced. I feel like if I have enough courage to go and enough of a thick skin to go out into public debates, to express my ideas, to say we need controversy, we need these ideas to be expressed, that, I think, is a kind of cure that we need to have. And simply saying there is no racism, that we shouldn't try and deal with racism, we shouldn't let people express their ideas that somebody might be a racist or something might be racist. To me, that's a ridiculous solution to the problem. The problem is not that the far left controls academia, and certainly naming how many Democrats are in a particular elite university is not proof of the far left. If you look at the numbers, in fact, surveys have found about 6% of college faculty say they are leftist. 33% will say they're liberal, 30% moderately conservative, and 4% strong conservative. There isn't this kind of right-wing, left-wing takeover of higher education that's been going on. There isn't this kind of intolerance. There isn't this attack on free speech and academic freedom. There are incidents. There is a struggle going on in higher education, and we need to deal with that. We need to deal with the attacks on the NEH and the NEA and the ISTUC gag rules that are going on from the right as well. We can't just simply say the left is the cause of all the problems in higher education. We need to instead to say we need to uphold principles of free speech and academic freedom.
Thank you, John. Peter, you have 2 minutes.
Well, let me just make one quick point and one quick summary. Again, it's always difficult to quantify these things, to know exactly what's going on. One, I think, really interesting gauge of sort of the tenor of what's happening on college campuses is if you look at the commencement speakers at these college campuses. If you look at the 100 top colleges as ranked by U.S. News and World Report, Young America's Foundation did a survey on this, and they found that last year only a single college had someone who could be considered conservative. It was I don't remember the college. It was, I believe, Congressman Dan Livingston from Louisiana, sort of a moderate to conservative type Republican, was at one college. That was the only one out of 100 who was conservative. Not all of them were political, but you had a lot of people who were then the full spectrum further to the left. There is a huge skewing. And I want to suggest to you that a large part of the reason we have this problem of political correctness is, of course, John's right about this too, is that political correctness has not been defined by the people who are politically correct. It's been defined by the victims of political correctness. And the people who are politically correct, the people who are on these college campuses, do not see themselves as leftists or liberals. They might see themselves as quite moderate. And, you know, if you are a supporter of Jesse Jackson, you might be right in the middle of your college campus community. You might be a moderate. But you're not a moderate for the rest of the country. And that's why there is this incredible skewing. And I think this whole debate is, in a sense, symptomatic of a profound disconnect between what's happening in academia and what is happening in the rest of America. The kinds of debates we're having in D.C. right now, in many other places in this country about some of the fundamental problems we have in our society are not being held on college campuses. And I think that's too bad, because there is much that could be contributed there, and I think, unfortunately, much of the focus on this multicultural agenda has served as a sort of substitute for discussion of more important, more serious topics, a meltdown in our education system, the cultural meltdown in America, the economic stagnation in our society. All those kinds of problems are not ones you will talk about when you spend all of your time looking for racism everywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank both of you. We have some time for questions and discussion now, and I'm actually going to take the prerogative of asking the first one. And I have a question for each one of you. First, for John, I would like to ask you about is there, and to what extent does the Academy have a responsibility to teach any underlying fundamental ideas in the basis of civil society? And is that at all something which our professors should be teaching our students? And let me go ahead and ask my other question to Peter at the same time. On the flip side, it's always noted that one of the most healthy and important aspects at the heart of Western civilization is a certain degree of philosophical skepticism, right? The Socratic method. Right. How far does that go, and how important that is it to question our culture as the basis of higher education? So I think that asks an opposite question to both of your positions. So John, why don't you go ahead and answer that first?
Well, I think we do have an obligation to teach the basis of civil society. I think one of those bases is arguing and debating, as Peter actually pointed out, part of the Western culture is arguing and debating these ideas, not imposing an orthodoxy, not imposing just one point of view. And I think that's one of the things we need to teach, that part of teaching Western culture, part of teaching Western civilization, is teaching about how Western civilization has been imperfect, is about teaching about the failures, is about teaching about the debates within our history. And so I think we really deprive students of a necessary education if we just create a kind of superficial and patriotic history that tries to pretend like nothing's ever been wrong.
Well, you know, I often wonder whether John and I are on the same planet or something. But you know, I think there are very few people who are trying to create a superficial or patriotic history. This may have been true on the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the United States in the Western world in 1892. That people were creating a somewhat fictitious account of Columbus. This was certainly not true in 1992. Again, just to take that as one example, that when you had the 500th anniversary of Columbus's travels to the U.S., people were extremely critical of it. And again, I think the problem is that things have gone too far. We've gone from blind self-congratulation to this blind scorched earth strategy, and we need to find some balance in between. And that's an indirect way of answering your question, which of course is that we need to question our culture. We need to be critical. We need to ask some very tough questions about things that are happening in our society. But there's a question about how you go about doing that. And I think it's not really, you're never going to really get to any of the deeper questions when you put everything into these neat categories of racism, sexism, other forms of oppression. You will never even be able to really get to a fundamental questioning about what's wrong. And so I think that critical thinking does require a broad base of knowledge to even get off the ground and to be thinking rather than merely critical.
Great. Okay. Well, Q&A now. Please be succinct and to the point and ask direct questions. How's that? Start down here in the front. Sir.
John, this is a question for you. I'm sure you know that Arthur Schlesinger is probably not well known as a hardcore right-wing fascist. Was highly critical of the history standards that you so provided as an accolade. Why do you suppose that was the case? And do you criticize? Are you in disagreement with his analysis?
Yeah, I would say I am in disagreement with his analysis. I have to admit I'm a little skeptical of the kind of the argument. Look, this person's a liberal and they don't like political correctness. Therefore, it must be a terrible problem on college campuses. The fact is, when you get on a college campus, the words liberal and conservative start to mean different things. There are people who are very liberal and even left-wing in their external politics, but they become very conservative when it comes to what they teach. When it comes, they want to teach the traditional subjects. Even if they hold democratic or left-wing views in the outside politics. So in that sense, I think we have to debate these issues on the actual facts, to dig down into the facts, say who is right about whether this is biased or not, rather than saying, well, I'm a liberal, therefore I hold authority over this political correctness debate.
Very, very brief.
Very brief. What the hell does Abu Musa have to do with American history?
I don't know. I probably ought to learn.
That was one of the examples. The great success of Mali civilization in the Middle Ages is a phenomenal import to American history and the American history standards that we were trying to create. The Western civilization.
Well, again, this is a subject where I actually don't know. That wasn't taught in my history class, that anything resembling that.
Okay, point made. Way in the back.
I mean, aren't we evading the whole issue here? Isn't the real issue about multiculturalism that it's pluralism, it's philosophical pluralism? It isn't the problem with the campuses that it's not about, oh, we should question things. Aren't you actually saying we shouldn't question anything, that everything is equally valid, that every culture has an equally valid relationship to truth? I mean, a university is supposed to be the pursuit of wisdom, but that's not what multiculturalism, diversity training, and political correctness is about. It's saying that, this culture, this Eastern culture and its philosophies or sexual orientation are equally valid to our traditional ideas. I mean, if it's not about...
Yeah, okay. Got the question. I basically agree that a lot of that is what's going on. I'll add this qualifier, however, which is that they're not uniformly culturally relativist, because when it comes to Western society, they are never relativist. Western society is always worse. You're culturally relative when you're dealing with other societies and when you want to excuse them. And so you have to be a little bit skeptical about the cultural relativism argument, because what I think is really going on in practice is we use cultural relativism so we don't need to question other societies, and so we can use them as vehicles to beat up on our own.
Right, it's equally valid. I mean, is the color purple really equally valid to Shakespeare? I mean, is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't know if it's a question of equally valid. You don't necessarily assign 1, 2, 3, 4, rank all the great books in history. You read lots of novels for lots of reasons.
Some ideas are just superior to other ideas. Why are you saying that we shouldn't do that?
Well, I think what we have to do, I think we should read both Shakespeare and, certainly in some cases, The Color Purple. We're actually reading a lot more Shakespeare than The Color Purple.
That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. Why does diversity, does it so patently refuse to take a stand on anything, to make a value judgment, and why does it avoid even identifying that it does refuse to make a value judgment?
I think I am not a relativist. I think we make value judgments all the time. I am completely against relativism, and I don't think it really exists at all. And I think, for example, if you take multiculturalism, who's been leading the worldwide crusade against female genital mutilation in African countries and Asian countries? Is it a conservative? No, it's Alice Walker. And certainly she's not being a relativist saying there. She's saying it's wrong to do that. And ironically, a lot of the complaints about political correctness and multiculturalism is that people are making judgments, as they ought to do. They make some judgments. Certainly, what we ought to do is look at other cultures, and there are reasons for anthropologists to look at other cultures as kind of relativists to try and give us more objective ways of viewing them. But we do have to make judgments. I think we have to make judgments of our own culture even more than we have to make judgments of other cultures, because it's so much a part of us.
Right over here.
It's a question for John. What do you make of the ideological mindset of professors when every Ivy League college, with the exception of Princeton, offers more courses in women's studies than in economics, and there rarely is more than a dozen people enrolling as majors in women's studies, when there's more than usually about 500 people enrolled as majors in economics?
Well, I think you have to be very careful there of looking at course catalogs and thinking you see reality. The fact is, economics as a discipline traditionally gives people very few options. You take an introductory course, then an advanced course, so-and-so. They don't give you many choices. That's part of what economics as a discipline has done. Whereas women's studies, in women's studies, you have a lot of different choices. And presumably there are people outside of women's studies who are interested in these classes. There are very few women's studies majors, but there are a lot of people like me, interested in these issues about gender. So I don't think there's anything wrong with a college offering lots of classes, lots of electives on women's studies, and I don't think you can judge that simply by saying there are only 7 classes on economics, because that's all the economics department wants to teach you.
Right. You guys have
Let me just add something to that. Look, obviously, all these statistics are all open to some interpretation, although I think this is an absolutely incredible indicator that, again, to take Stanford as an example, you have about 250 people majoring in economics, about 1/6 of the undergraduates. You have 4 or 5 a year majoring in feminist studies or gender studies. I guess gender studies is politically correct. Feminist studies is politically incorrect. I got a 5-minute lecture on that once. And you have more classes in gender studies than you have in economics. Now, I suppose there are lots of interpretations. The one thing I would like to suggest to you is that this phenomenon is not being driven by demand by radical students. That certainly is one characterization. I think it's primarily a supply side problem. It's a problem that we have this oversupply of left-wing faculty who want to teach feminist studies classes. And the way they teach them when people don't want to take them is they institute graduation requirements. At Stanford, they instituted a graduation requirement in gender studies a couple of years ago. They took polls of the students. Only about 30% of the students even wanted to take it. I'm not sure that's always the best indicator, but it was not being driven by student demand. It's being driven, it's a supply-side problem. Basically, the radicals of the 60s got their PhDs in the 70s. They were associate professors in the 80s, and they have tenure in the 90s, and it's going to be with us for quite a while.
Does that mean we should stop these professors from teaching these classes? Is that what you're advocating?
Well, I think... Well, let's talk about the whole academic freedom question very briefly. It's certainly, I certainly am hesitant to go in and stop any single professor from teaching things. But when you have something that's systemically skewed, you do have an obligation to revisit these things. And let's keep in mind, universities do not exist for the purpose of providing faculty with jobs. They exist to provide students with an education. And when you are reading The Color Purple and other books, there is a substitution effect. More serious topics get crowded out. I'm in favor of reading non-Western writers, but I'm willing to bet you, I haven't done a survey on this, but I'm willing to bet you that we would find more people reading The Color Purple than we would find reading Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago or Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And those are much more important books than The Color Purple.
John, just for the record, is there any course that if you were a dean of faculty, you would not allow a professor to teach?
Well, I think you have to be very leery about trying to impose those kind of restrictions, whether it's against a conservative faculty member that somebody doesn't like or whether it's a liberal faculty member that somebody doesn't like. There are all sorts of considerations about having classes that people need to teach as opposed to giving people opportunities, but I would be very leery about forbidding a certain topic from being taught. I think that's a very dangerous way to approach things.
The gentleman right here.
A major topic that's been emerging on the college campus is the issue of student fees, and that being giving the student the right to choose where his or her fees go to. And people consider it to be what really funds a lot of these organizations that a lot of people have problems with. I'd like to know what both of your opinion is on it, and if it's a viable option for the college campus.
Take it first. I mean, I think the student fee issue, again, to sort of explain what goes on typically is you have students at most college campuses are some sort of tax is imposed on them once a year, maybe $50, $60 on top of their tuition, and the money then gets allocated by the student government typically, which is typically controlled by often quite liberal students, to sort of a smorgasbord of left-wing organizations. It's one of the main ways that a lot of this stuff gets perpetrated informally. Now, and I think the solution there, as a solution for all of these problems, is going to be to make the system more transparent, for people to become aware of what's happening. The first step towards solving a problem is to discuss it. And I think the way we're going to solve the problem of political correctness is to talk about it, to have debates like this one. I think the student fees issue, the more transparent you make it, the more options you give people on whether they want to fund this or not, the more difficult it will be to keep the whole left-wing machine functioning.
I think the student fees issue is transparently, as Peter sort of admitted, an attempt to defund the left, basically saying if we can get rid of the funding for these left-wing groups, then the major national right-wing foundations, this foundation, Young America's Foundation, all of these foundations will have much more influence and much more money to be able to impose their ideas. I think there is a social good in having student groups on campuses and having having lecturers on campus. And I think just as I pay taxes for certain things that the government does that I don't approve of, I also pay student fees for certain groups that I don't approve of. But there's a larger social good that comes from having these different groups on campus that are alive and thriving and can debate these things.
Even at a private university?
Yes, even at...
We add one other point to that, though. I mean, there is a very important difference between conservative foundations funding various kinds of on-campus events and having a hidden tax imposed on students funding all sorts of left-wing speakers. I'm in favor of making the process transparent. Now, if it's made transparent, that may or may not lead to defunding. I happen to suspect it will lead to significant defunding, but that suggests not that we shouldn't make it transparent, it suggests there's something wrong with the current funding regime.
Great. There was a question right over here.
I'd like to go back to an issue that John raised earlier, which was the National History Standards. That's something that Young America's Foundation has been researching, and we found that 19 mentions were made of the Ku Klux Klan, 17 mentions were made of Joe McCarthy, while 1 mention was made of George Washington. Now, I think that's a really frightening message to give to our young people, and I'm just wondering how you feel about making Joe McCarthy and the Ku Klux Klan 36 times more important than George Washington.
Well, it's not. That kind of counting is a very deceptive tactic that Lynn Cheney used and a lot of other people have used. For example, those mentions of the KKK, you don't get told that 8 of them are in one paragraph, whereas you have another paragraph of similar size that mentions the Gettysburg Address, and is a wonderful question, asking people to compare it with the Declaration of Independence, all of these things, but it only gets counted once, because it only happens to be mentioned once in that paragraph. I think that a lot of the general themes, the fact is, the history standards assumed that people were going to do this. Lynn Cheney makes a lot of how the standards don't mention that George Washington was our first president. Well, these are standards for not for students to be given directly to students. They're for teachers to use in their designing their curriculum. They're for people writing textbooks. And I think if we're going to take up space saying George Washington was our first president to history teachers, if they don't know that, we're already in deep trouble.
Well, I haven't taken a poll on that, but I actually suspect there are a fair number, maybe not history teachers, but students in history classes who do not know that. And I think we should not be so naive as to assume that that people are going to do the right thing if they're not being told what to do, or that people will know that George Washington is the president, that this will be a priority if it's not included in standards like these. Now, I'm not sure these sorts of national standards are the right way to go. I think there's generally a very big problem with them, which is that these sorts of across-the-board standards tend to get co-opted. And I think it was a very serious mistake on Lynn Cheney's part to initially set them up, and I think she's admitted as much. But I think that that certainly the numerical stuff it's not a perfect indicator, but it's a start, and this is the way you get a handle on what's happening.
Great. There's a gentleman way in the back who has a question.
Yeah, somebody once said that, you all might know the name of this person, but the victors write history. Isn't multiculturalism the way for losers to write history? And I use that as an example of a story about Alexandria City Schools, who surveyed high school students and found that most of them didn't know or actually thought that the United States started World War II in the Pacific. And they came to that conclusion based on the fact that almost 2/3 of their studies on the Pacific War concentrated on the U.S. decision to drop the atomic bomb, the victimization of the Japanese, and totally ignored everything else. It seems to me it's a way for basically losers to rewrite history.
Well, I wouldn't say losers to rewrite history. It is true that this new way of looking at history is kind of history from the bottom. It's looking at history not from the people who won it, but from the people who are ignored in traditional histories. And I think that's important. I think it is important to...
People who are ignored in history, then what about the rape of Manchuria, which is not mentioned in most high school history textbooks at all? You're going to see page after page and paragraph after paragraph of how horrible people were hurt in Hiroshima, that it was a total civilian military target, which the facts sort of indicate otherwise. Don't people have to know, for instance, shouldn't somebody know that the United States didn't start World War II, for instance? And don't you think it's dangerous that we're breeding a whole bunch of people that think the U.S. did start World War II, just as in Germany after World War II, people didn't believe the Holocaust actually
Well,
occurred?
I don't think that's happening in college. You can cite one school system where a survey shows something like that. I don't think in general that's what's happening. I think most students, if they know anything, know that the U.S. did not start World War II. The problem is they don't necessarily know very much. And I think we need to get away from trying to discuss, well, are we going to allow this to be debated or are we going to exclude this? What we ought to do is concentrate much more on creating interesting history, creating thoughtful debates on these things so that students will learn history, both sides of many different sides of history, including rape in Manchuria and all of these things, and not be bored to death not be overwhelmed with droning facts that are out of in pure isolation like they are now.
Well, let me just, 2 quick points. I mean, again, theoretically, I agree with most of it, although we obviously are going to differ on some of the details. One other point of fact I wanted to mention is sort of in the category of people being ignorant of American history and what this country is all about. There's a survey taken a couple of years ago which found that over half the U.S. population believed that the words "from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs" was to be found in the U.S. Constitution. And I do think that we have some problems here. The larger point about this question of losers writing history, winners writing history, these sorts of questions, I think it's a tricky question who you want to look to in all these contexts. But again, one of the things that the Manchuria example points to is this incredible double standard. We don't apply the same standards to other cultures that we're applying to the West. And I would like to have some consistency. I've said that I think one of the cures for multiculturalism, for the sort of fictitious multiculturalism that we have taking place today, is some real multiculturalism, is some genuine study of other cultures. One of my friends was in Egypt for a couple of years and told me that you had a number of African American students coming to Egypt to study because they've been told this was where their roots were and so on from the Afrocentric mythology. And one of the things they experienced there was racism far worse than anything they had ever experienced in the U.S. And it was a real eye-opener to them. And I think that as we actually implement some of the multicultural rhetoric and really start to learn about other cultures, the whole system is going to collapse because it's just so totally false.
There have been a number of questions here about standards and the question of especially history standards. Does not the very question of standards raise the requirement to make distinction between better and worse history and more important, less important things to teach? And if so, what then is the hierarchy by which you make those standards? I mean, obviously you can't teach everything because if you try to teach everything, you end up teaching nothing, right? So how do you make those kind of decisions?
Well, I think
I ask that to both of you.
I think one of the ways that it has to be done is in many ways. I think the model of college education is an ideal that we should follow. Instead of having these standardized textbooks and throwing them at teachers and training them to just teach the textbooks, what we ought to do is encourage much more individual initiative. That's why the National History Standards in their original form, that is now destroyed, were so valuable. They gave lots of different examples. Teachers could choose some that they found very interesting and contributed to what they wanted to do in their classroom. And so I think we have to adopt that kind of individual entrepreneur teacher in the classroom as opposed to just somebody who's going to be following orders. And that's what the standards were. They weren't trying to say, you must teach this.
Peter, what's your standard?
Well, I suppose there are a lot of different things you can go into, and this is always a very tricky sort of topic. But I would say when we talk about what kinds of books should be read in a classics department, an English department, in a philosophy course, things of that sort, I would suggest one standard I would use is I would not include anything that was written in the last 30 years or 40 years. I think one of the standards is I would like to see things that have withstood the test of time. I think that when you are in a contemporary situation, you're so caught up in these kinds of issues, you might think Alice Walker is the most important thing in the world. I personally don't think she is. I doubt anyone will think this 30 years from now. And I think we want to gain a little bit more perspective on our situation. We have to, I would suggest that would be a minimum standard. And then you can go into a lot of other kinds of details. But yeah, that would be a starting point.
Great. So as we don't fail the test of time, and we've been here about an hour, we'll have a last question and perhaps a very short question, if possible, right here in the back.
Traditionally, Western society has valued individual rights over group identity. Multicultural type teachings tend to inflame groupism on college campuses, and many say this leads to self-segregation and subsequently discrimination. How does this help disenfranchised populations on campus to do this? I guess that's for both of you.
I don't think there's really the kind of war between group identity and individual rights that goes on. When you talk about racism and you talk about people trying to deal with it, I think they are in some sense talking about individual rights. But you can't just say individual rights, that there's no such thing as racism anymore, that people aren't treated as if they're members of groups, because they are. And I think what you have to do is realize that when you talk about groupism, that's not exactly the issue. The issue is talking about very real segregation, very real racism and sexism that exist in America and elsewhere in the world, certainly. So I don't think that self-segregation is a solution. I don't think it's the main cause of the problem, though. And so I would say that we need to talk about individual rights, but we also have to realize that part of individual rights is equality. Part of individual rights is not being discriminated against, not being treated differently based on race. And also part of individual rights has to take account of the historical forces of segregation, the fact that there are different cultures in America, that there is such a thing, for example, as African American culture. You don't want to define it narrowly. You don't want to say you're not African American enough, but you have to realize that there are differences. And you have to, at some point, recognize what these are and try to discuss them.
Peter?
Well, you know, again, I sort of agree with part of the theory, although actually very little of that. And I guess part of the problem is that once you start recognizing all these various group rights and group responsibilities and so on, there really is not very much space for the individual left. And I think this is the problem with this rampant politicization, is that, you know, when you have multiculturalism debated in bathroom stall cartoons, which was the case at Stanford, when you have this stuff being pushed every single place, every single avenue, there is no space for the individual left. The needs of the collective trump the rights of the individual. And I'll leave it at that. That's the basic.
Great. We're going to take one last question. He's promised it will be short.
This is going to sound like a trick question, but who do you think would be best able to write your own history? Do you think you would be best qualified to do it, or someone else?
Well, my answer is very simple. I would, by definition, not be qualified, since I gave you the 30 to 40 year rule, and so it would be someone who lived at least 40 years after I did.
I think we should all talk about writing and looking at the histories of other people. I don't think that, for example, African American history is limited to African Americans to discuss. What I think we have to do is recognize there are different histories, there are different threads of history throughout our civilization, throughout Western culture. And we have to recognize that there's a responsibility for all of us. It doesn't matter what race or gender or whatever, to look at these issues. And I think there's a very exciting intellectual opportunities here. There's really has been something that I wish more people would pay attention to and study and argue about in a lot of what's been brought up recently.
Great. I'd like to thank both of our authors and remind you that both of their books, in a good capitalist sense, are available out in the lobby. And I encourage you to take a look at them and continue our discussion. And I would also like to encourage you again to think about our annual conference, which will be a week from this coming Saturday. I thank you for coming and have a good evening. Thank you.